The drive had been a pilgrimage of sorts, a deliberate shedding of the world. Miles dissolved behind me, the last gas station a distant, flickering memory in the rearview mirror. Pavement gave way to gravel, then to a track barely wider than my tires, carved through gnarled, salt-blasted scrub. The air thickened, heavy with the metallic tang of the ocean and something else, something ancient and cold, that seeped into the car's vents. I gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight. A determined ache in my jaw. This was it, the edge of everything. The cottage materialized through a veil of mist and gathering dusk, a hunched silhouette against the bruised sky. It wasn't picturesque. It was a testament to neglect, a structure that seemed less built than grown from the very rock it clung to. Windows, opaque with grime, stared out like blind eyes. The paint, once white, was scabrous with peeling layers, revealing the dark, weathered wood beneath. A broken picket fence, half swallowed by thorny bushes, offered no illusion of welcome. This was the inheritance from my estranged grandmother, the final, peculiar legacy of a woman I barely knew. My reasons for coming were simple, stark. The city had become a cage, its noise a constant, unbearable static in my skull. The canvas in my studio remained stubbornly blank, my hands paralyzed by a grief that had festered into a deep, creative paralysis. This isolated stretch of coast, with its promise of utter solitude, seemed the only cure. I killed the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute, broken only by the relentless sibilance of the waves crashing somewhere below the cliff, a sound like a giant's slow, deliberate breathing. Stepping out, the wind immediately assaulted me, whipping my hair across my face, tugging at my clothes. The cottage felt, watched. I shook off the thought. Exhaustion, I told myself. Nerves. My gaze drifted beyond the cottage, following a faint, overgrown path that led further along the cliff. There, hunkering low against the horizon, was another building, larger, more imposing, its gray stone walls seemingly impenetrable. It was a utilitarian structure, blocky and severe, with no windows facing my direction. A rusty sign, barely legible through the salt corrosion, confirmed my suspicion: commissary storage after lockdown. It looked like it had been locked down for decades, a derelict monument to forgotten provisions, its purpose long past. Its presence, so close to the cottage, only deepened the sense of abandonment that permeated the landscape. I turned back to the cottage, pulling my duffel bag from the trunk. The heavy oak door, warped and scarred, groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Inside, a wave of stale air met me, thick with dust and the cloying scent of damp wood rot. My breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight beam cutting a swath through the gloom. The room was a tableau of arrested decay. Dust sheets, gray and brittle, draped over furniture that time had forgotten. A claw-footed table stood in the center, its surface etched with rings from countless forgotten cups. Every surface was coated in a fine, powdery film, undisturbed for years. I walked deeper, my boots scuffing on the gritty floorboards. Each step echoed, amplified by the emptiness. I ran a hand over a wooden banister leading to a narrow staircase. The wood felt strangely porous, almost spongy beneath my fingertips. A shiver traced its way down my spine. Just the age. Upstairs, the rooms were equally sparse, equally neglected. A narrow bed, its mattress sunken and stained, sat in what must have been the main bedroom. From the window, I could see it clearly now, the lighthouse. Here, it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, something holding its breath. I stood in the center of the bedroom, listening. The wind outside keened, a mournful cry that seemed to wrap around the cottage, testing its ancient timbers. And beneath that, I could almost discern a faint creaking, a shifting, as if the house itself was settling or perhaps waking. A faint scratching sound like fingernails on wood made me jump. I spun around, flashlight beam sweeping the room. Nothing. Only the peeling wallpaper. The cobwebs hanging like shrouds, the stillness. My heart thumped against my ribs, a sudden frantic rhythm. It was a branch, I decided, brushing against the exterior, or a rodent. This place was old. It would have its noises. I set down my bag, the thud resonating loudly. This wasn't just isolation, it was abandonment. A deep, profound abandonment. And for a fleeting, unsettling moment, I wondered if I had found the cure for my torment or merely walked into another, far older one. The final stretch of path, a desperate vein through the desolation, finally spilled me out onto a windswept clearing. Before me, hunkered against the vast slate-gray expanse of the sea, stood the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It wasn't picturesque. It was a block of weathered stone, squat and defiant, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning Atlantic. To its left, a towering skeletal finger of wrought iron and glass, the lighthouse itself. Loomed against the bruised sky, its lens dark and lifeless. A profound silence enveloped the place, broken only by the relentless shriek of the wind and the hungry roar of the waves. It was the kind of quiet that swallowed sound, that felt ancient and absolute. I cut the engine, and the sudden cessation of the truck's rumble left a ringing vacuum in my ears. For a long moment, I simply sat, letting the isolation seep into my bones. This was it, my escape, my fortress against the world. Stepping out, the wind immediately tried to tear my jacket from my shoulders. The air was thick with salt and the metallic tang of damp rock. I circled the cottage, my boots crunching on loose shale. The paint was peeling in thick flakes, revealing layers of forgotten colors. Moss clung to the north-facing walls like a verdant beard. I noticed a smaller, crumbling structure further down the track. A low-slung building with boarded-up windows and a rusted padlock on its heavy door. It looked like an old supply depot, labeled by a faded hand-painted sign, commissary storage after lockdown. A relic of another time, another life that had once pulsed here. It only added to the sense of forgotten history, of a place left to decay. Inside, the cottage was a mausoleum of dust and forgotten things. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something vaguely metallic. Like old pennies, my grandmother had left little: a few pieces of sturdy, sea-worn furniture, a stack of yellowed maritime charts, and a pervasive sense of absence. I spent the first hours simply opening windows, letting the furious wind scour the rooms, dragging my worn canvas bags inside. I found a small, north-facing room, its single window offering a stark view of the churning gray-green sea, and decided it would be my studio. I hauled in my easel, my paint boxes, the canvases wrapped in plastic sheeting. The act of arranging my tools, wiping down the grimy wooden floorboards, felt like a ritual, a reclaiming. For the first time in months, the dull ache behind my eyes, the constant hum of anxiety seemed to recede. I was alone, truly alone, and it was a balm. I made a simple meal of canned soup and stale bread, eating in the vast, echoing kitchen. The wind rattled the window panes, a mournful lament that seemed to coil around the cottage. I told myself it was just the wind, nothing more. Later, curled up on a lumpy mattress in the main bedroom, the sound of the ocean was a constant, rhythmic pulse beneath the house. I drifted, half asleep, when I heard it. A soft, distinct thud from downstairs. My eyes snapped open. The cottage was old, I reasoned, settling. The wind was fierce. It could be anything: a loose shutter, a branch against the wall. I pulled the heavy wool blanket tighter, listening. Only the wind and the waves now. My mind, so accustomed to hypervigilance, was playing tricks. The next morning the sun broke through, painting the sea in shimmering golds and blues, a cruel mockery of its previous fury. I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I unrolled a large canvas, primed and waiting, and set about sketching. Hours melted away. The quiet hummed around me, broken only by the scratch of charcoal on canvas. It was mid-afternoon when I went to fetch a specific shade of blue from my paint box, which I was certain I'd left on the small wooden table beside my easel. But it wasn't there. My gaze swept the floor, the windowsill, the few shelves, nothing. I felt a prickle of annoyance. I was usually meticulous about my tools. Had I carried it into the kitchen? No, that made no sense. I walked into the main living area, eyes scanning the dusty surfaces. My paint box. A wave of irrational frustration washed over me. I must have moved it myself, unconsciously, perhaps during my initial unpacking haze. My mind was still untangling itself from the knots of the past. It was an old house, after all, full of quirks. I picked up the box, the wood cool beneath my fingers, and carried it back to my studio. My breath hitched for a moment. No, I told myself, no. The latch was old, loose. The wind, constantly buffeting the cottage, must have worked it open. I walked over and pushed it firmly shut, testing the latch. It clicked securely. This was just the house settling, I decided, the old bones groaning. The isolation was a double-edged sword, offering solace but also amplifying every creak, every shift of the old structure. I needed to focus. I needed to paint. Anything else was just my imagination, fraying at the edges. The lighthouse keeper's cottage didn't welcome me. It crouched low against the relentless wind, a block of grey stone that looked less built and more hewn directly from the cliff face. Its windows, dark and vacant, were like the eyes of something long dead, staring out at the churning, slate-grey sea. No quaint porch, no inviting garden path, just a desperate, weed-choked rectangle of flagstones leading to a heavy, salt-pitted door. The air here was a physical force, smelling of brine, damp rock, and something else, a metallic tang I couldn't quite place, like old rust mixed with the breath of deep-sea creatures. I pushed the door open. It groaned, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the place, releasing a puff of stagnant air. Inside, the gloom was immediate, profound. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that managed to pierce the grime-caked windows, illuminating a scene of utter neglect. The floorboards were warped. The wallpaper peeled in curling strips like dry skin, and a thick layer of fine gray dust coated every surface, preserving the ghosts of furniture in soft, indistinct mounds. The silence was absolute, heavier than any I'd known, broken only by the mournful shriek of the wind outside, a sound that somehow intensified the quiet within. My grandmother, I mused, had left this place to rot, or perhaps it had been rotting long before she arrived. The thought made a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. This wasn't just neglect. It felt like abandonment, a hasty retreat. I dragged my duffel bag inside, the soft thud of it hitting the floor echoing unnaturally. My art supplies, the canvases and paints I'd hoped would resurrect my dormant creativity, felt impossibly heavy, anchors dragging me down rather than tools to lift me up. The initial comfort of isolation had already begun to curdle into something else, a profound, unsettling loneliness that felt less like solitude and more like being utterly, hopelessly alone in a place that actively resented my presence. I started to explore, not with curiosity, but with a determined, almost grim resolve. I needed to claim this space, to impose my will on its decaying stillness. Upstairs, 2 cramped bedrooms, one with a narrow cot, the other with a larger, sagging mattress, both smelling of mildew and forgotten dreams. No sign of my grandmother's eccentricities, no half-finished projects, no personal touches beyond the pervasive dust. It was as if he had simply vanished, leaving nothing but the shell of a life. My search turned more specific. I wasn't just looking for a place to sleep. I was looking for a narrative, an explanation for this inherited desolation. I remembered a vague childhood memory, a hushed conversation about a storage room, a place my grandmother supposedly kept her more sensitive belongings. It was always spoken of with a peculiar inflection, a mix of reverence and fear. Behind the old stove, almost entirely obscured by a leaning stack of firewood and a forgotten rusted bucket, I found it. It had no handle, only a large iron latch, secured by a thick, corroded padlock. The metal was so encrusted with rust it looked like a growth. This had to be it. This had to be the commissary storage after lockdown. The phrase clicked into place in my mind, a forgotten echo from that childhood memory. It wasn't just a pantry, it was a designated, secured space, sealed off for a reason I couldn't yet fathom. My determination hardened. The padlock resisted, groaning and spitting rust flakes as I worked. My muscles ached, but I kept at it, a desperate need to uncover whatever lay behind that door driving me. Finally, with a sharp, grating snap, the shackle gave way. The air inside was different, stale but dry, carrying a faint, musty scent of old paper and dried herbs. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserved goods, tins of ancient biscuits, and bundles of dried herbs, a true commissary, just as the name implied. But in the center, on a small, sturdy table, sat a wooden chest. This was it. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle, yellowed linen, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth in places, the spine cracked, and the pages within were thick with the unmistakable scent of age. Alongside it lay a small, tarnished brass compass, its needle perpetually spinning, never settling, and a handful of smooth, gray pebbles, each one carved with a single, indecipherable symbol. But it was the journal that drew me in. I opened it to the first page, the paper crackling softly. The handwriting was neat, precise, but grew increasingly erratic as I flipped through the initial entries. My grandmother's name wasn't on the first page, but further in, a familiar looping signature confirmed it was hers. He had kept a journal. The early entries were mundane, observations about the weather, lists of provisions, notes on lighthouse maintenance. Then the tone shifted. August 14th. The lights again, not the beacon, something else. Deep in the water, moving with a purpose. I frowned, reading on, my eyes scanning the faded ink. September 3rd, from the sea like a mournful singing, but with words I cannot quite grasp. It's in my head, I tell myself. The wind outside picked up, rattling a loose pane somewhere upstairs, a sound like a dry cough. October 19th. It's not in my head. The singing is clearer now, a chorus, and the lights, they answer it, red and green, like eyes beneath the waves. It clings to me, a shroud. I looked up from the journal, my gaze fixed on the small, high window of the commissary storage. The words, my grandmother's words, were echoing in my mind, painting vivid, terrifying images, strange lights from the sea. This wasn't just my past trauma manifesting. This was something real, something rooted in the very fabric of this place, something my grandmother had seen and heard, and he had been afraid. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floorboards beneath me, or was it just my imagination, a trick of the straining wood? I gripped the journal tighter, the rough leather digging into my palms. And I, Diego, was no longer just an artist seeking solace. I was a target, unsettling. That was the word that had been cut short, but it hung in the air, thick and cloying, even after I'd closed the journal. I was still in the commissary storage after lockdown, the small, high window, a bleak rectangle of bruised sky. My grandmother's scrawled accounts of impossible lights dancing on the waves, of a presence that pulled at the edges of her sanity, felt less like faded ink and more like a fresh wound. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize the ramblings of an old woman living in isolation, but the words had taken root. The first hint of the escalation wasn't a sound, but a chill. It was a cold that didn't belong, a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that pricked my skin like needles. I spun around, my breath fogging, but there was nothing. Just the dusty shelves, the forgotten supplies. I shivered, convincing myself it was just the draft, a creak in the old structure, the cottage settling. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, a metallic tang like old pennies mixed with something else, something organic and decaying, like seaweed left to rot under a scorching sun, but deeper, fouler. I wrinkled my nose, scanning the shelves for a forgotten spill or a dead rodent, but found nothing. I was trying to paint, trying to lose myself in the familiar strokes of a brush, but my mind kept snagging on my grandmother's words. They were faint, like dry leaves skittering across a distant pavement or grains of sand sifting through a sieve. They were too low to discern, a murmur that seemed to coil around the edges of my hearing, teasing me. I'd pause, holding my breath, straining to catch a word, a syllable, but they would vanish, leaving only the roar of the wind and the frantic thrum of my own pulse. I gripped the brush tighter, my grip tight. It was just the wind, I told myself, playing tricks on the old walls. Fleeting glimpses in my peripheral vision, a deepening of the gloom in a corner, a shape that detached itself from the wall for a fraction of a second before melting back into the stone. I'd whip my head around, my heart racing, only to find an empty space, the familiar patterns of the wallpaper undisturbed. My eyes darted, searching, but there was never anything concrete, just the impression, the afterimage of something that shouldn't have been there. It was like trying to catch smoke. The dreams intensified, bleeding into my waking hours. I dreamt of being submerged in icy water, the pressure crushing me, my lungs burning. And in these dreams, a presence was always there, an immense, silent weight that pressed down on me, not malicious, but possessive, ancient. One morning, after a particularly vivid nightmare where I saw my own reflection in the deep, black water, but my eyes were not my own, they were vast, ancient, and empty, I stumbled out of bed. It was taller than me, broader, and for a terrifying instant, it mimicked my posture, my slight stoop, before elongating, stretching into an impassable form that seemed to writhe and dissipate into the gloom of the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed for a rational explanation. Sleep deprivation, the flickering lamp, the old house. It was a direct observation, a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't just a trick of the light anymore. This thing was aware of me. It was studying me. A low, guttural sigh, like the ocean exhaling, but with an underlying current of something profoundly sorrowful, deeply lonely. It seemed to resonate from the very stones of the cottage, vibrating through the floorboards, up my legs, into my chest. I pressed my hands against my ears, desperate to shut it out, but it was inside me, an echo in my bones. My determination, once a shield, was starting to crack. I found myself checking locks multiple times, peering through windows, constantly scanning the corners of rooms. The solitude I had craved now felt like a trap. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every shift of the tide became a potential manifestation. I was no longer merely observing the strange phenomena, I was living within it, immersed in it. My sanity, I realized with a sickening lurch, was eroding like the cliffs outside, slowly but relentlessly, under the relentless assault of an unseen, insidious tide. Unsettling. The word had been cut short, but it hung in the air, thick and cloying, even after I'd closed the journal. I was still in the commissary storage after lockdown, the small, high window a bleak rectangle of bruised sky, now fading to a deep, bruised purple. The air in the room was a stale mix of salt, dust, and something metallic, like old coins left too long in a damp place. My grandmother's scrawled accounts of impossible light still burned behind my eyes. For a moment, I tried to dismiss it all. Old age. Solitude. The sea's ceaseless roar playing tricks on a mind already prone to flights of fancy. But the memories of the cottage, the whispers, the subtle shifts in the air, the way the light had pulsed from the lighthouse eye when it shouldn't have, they were too real, too persistent. They were not figments of an old woman's fading lucidity, nor were they mine. They were happening. My fingers, stiff with cold, found the worn cover of the journal again. I didn't want to open it, not really. But I had to know. The alternative was a blind stumble into whatever trap awaited me. I flipped past the last entry, the one about the unsettling light, and went deeper into the brittle, yellowed pages. The handwriting grew more frantic in places, more compressed, as if she'd been hurrying to capture thoughts before they fled, or before she herself did. And then I found it a section titled The Deep Song, written in a hand that was almost unrecognizably tight and small, as if she feared being overheard by the very paper. It wasn't a log of duties anymore. It was a collection of local legends, transcribed with a meticulousness that belied her later decline. Not just tales of loneliness and hard work, but of a different kind of vigil. A calling from the waves, she'd written, a voice that could pluck the sanity from a man like a gull snatches a fish. The entries spoke of a presence, not a beast with teeth and claws, but something formless, ancient, tied to the very essence of the tumultuous coast. It manifested as impassable light, pulsing from the depths, mimicking the lighthouse's beam, but with a quality that distorted the air, curdled the senses. And the keepers, those solitary souls, were its favored prey. One entry detailed a keeper from the late 1800, a man known for his stoic demeanor. He began to stare, my grandmother's words read, not at the horizon for ships, but down into the black water at the foot of the rock. He spoke of visions of things moving just beneath the surface, responding to his thoughts. Then one morning the relief crew found the door ajar, the lamp still burning, but the keeper was gone. No note, no struggle, just an empty space where a man had been. Another account, from the 1930s, spoke of a keeper who started scratching symbols into the walls of the lighthouse, strange, looping patterns that resembled eddies in the sea. He'd sing discordant melodies, his voice raspy, until one night, his singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a single guttural scream. The next day the window was shattered, and the keeper's boots were found neatly placed beside the precipice, facing the churning waves. Isolation bred vulnerability. The lighthouse, meant to guide, became a beacon for something else entirely, and the light, the very thing I'd been experiencing, was its herald. My gaze fell on a later entry dated just a few months before her death. The handwriting was almost illegible, a frantic spiderweb of ink. It knows I see it. It wants me to understand. The light, it's not just calling, it's showing. A figure that looked disturbingly like me. My grandmother hadn't just been a victim of her own mind. He had been fighting. He had been aware. He had been trying to warn me through these cryptic, desperate entries. The unsettling light she'd recorded was the same impassable glow I'd witnessed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This malevolent presence, this ancient hunger of the sea, wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was alive, it was active, and it wasn't just the lighthouse keepers it targeted. It was me. I was the new keeper, the new solitary soul on the rock, surrounded by its domain. I was the next one being watched, being called. The commissary storage after lockdown, usually a sanctuary of sorts, suddenly felt like a trap. I could almost hear the low, hungry sigh of the waves against the cliffs, a sound that now carried a new, terrifying implication. I was the target, and it had already found me. The guttural sound from the keeper's journal had lodged itself in my mind, a jagged shard of ice. I couldn't stay here. Not another minute. The morning light, an anemic gray through the salt-streaked panes, offered no comfort. It felt less like dawn and more like the lingering twilight of a dying world. Determination, cold and brittle, settled in my chest. I would leave today. I pulled on heavy boots, the leather stiff and protesting, and a thick, oilskin coat that smelled of damp wool and forgotten storms. Outside, the world was a maelstrom. A gale had whipped itself into a frenzy overnight, lashing the cottage with sheets of rain that sounded like handfuls of gravel flung against the glass. The air vibrated with the roar of the sea, a primal, hungry sound that seemed to swallow all others. My escape wouldn't be easy, but the alternative, remaining here, waiting for the insidious presence to tighten its grip, was unthinkable. The short walk to my car, parked on the gravel track that wound its way to the main road, was a brutal assault. The wind tore at my coat, trying to peel it from my back, and the rain stung my exposed skin like needles. I hunched my shoulders, pressing forward, each step a battle against the unseen force of the storm. The cottage, squat and defiant behind me, felt like a watchful eye. I fumbled with the key, my fingers numb, and yanked open the car door. The interior was a damp, cold tomb. I slid behind the wheel, shivering, and jammed the key into the ignition. It turned with a satisfying click. But when I twisted it further, the engine merely coughed, a weak, pathetic wheeze that died almost instantly. I tried again and again. Nothing. The battery, I thought, a sudden, sickening lurch in my gut. It had to be the battery or the damp. But as I sat there, the wind howling around the chassis, shaking the vehicle like a toy, an unwelcome thought slithered into my mind. This wasn't just a breakdown. This was too convenient, too absolute. The cottage, the storm, the failing car, it all felt like a carefully constructed barrier, an inescapable trap. I slammed my palm against the steering wheel, the sound swallowed by the storm's fury. I was stuck, truly, utterly trapped, my breath plumed in the frigid air. The fuel gauge still showed a quarter tank, but what good was fuel without an engine? I had to get back inside, reassess. There had to be something, some way. I retreated, defeated. The short journey back to the cottage feeling infinitely longer. The lighthouse, a spectral finger against the bruised sky, seemed to beckon, its rotating beam cutting through the gloom with an unnerving regularity. The light, usually a distant comfort, now felt like a predatory eye watching my every move. I could feel its pull, a strange, almost magnetic sensation in my bones, urging me towards the precipice, towards the churning chaos of the sea. My stomach rumbled, a stark reminder of my physical needs. I needed to eat, to think. I remembered the small stock of canned goods and dried staples in the commissary storage after lockdown, a forgotten annex off the kitchen that my grandmother had used for emergencies. The storage room was a narrow, windowless space, smelling faintly of dust and dried herbs. The single bare bulb overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the shelves stacked with provisions. As I reached for a tin of beans, a low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a resonance that was too deep, too steady to be the wind. It felt like it was coming from within the earth, or perhaps from within the very walls of the cottage. I froze, my hand hovering over the shelf. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through my teeth, making my skull ache. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears alone. It was a sensation, a pressure in my chest. It wasn't English or any language I knew. My skin crawled. The air around me grew heavy, thick, as if the very space was being compressed. It felt like a song, a discordant, ancient melody meant only for me. My eyes darted around the small room, searching for a source, but there was nothing. Just shelves of food, dust motes dancing in the harsh light, and the overwhelming, undeniable presence of something unseen. It wasn't just a mental suggestion now. It was a physical yearning, a deep ache in my core, urging me to step out into the storm, to walk towards the beacon, towards the violent, indifferent sea. I stumbled back, knocking a stack of tins to the floor with a deafening clatter. My breath came in ragged gasps. It was communicating, it was luring me, and I was trapped with nowhere to go, no one to hear my pleas, and a growing, horrifying certainty that the lighthouse was not just a structure, but a maw waiting to swallow me whole. Dying world. I stumbled backward, the journal clattering to the floor like a broken bone. The sound it had made, that wet, guttural exhalation, was still vibrating against my eardrums, an echo of something ancient and unspeakable. My breath hitched, a ragged rasp in the stillness of the cottage. I couldn't be here, not one more second. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, every creak of the old timbers sounded like a whispered threat. I bolted. The front door, usually a stubborn beast of warped wood, flew open with a shriek that ripped through the dawn. The salt-laden air hit me cold and sharp, but offered no solace. My flight was a blur, a frantic scramble through what I thought was the overgrown path. But the path twisted, narrowed, the air grew heavy, thick with a scent that was not sea salt, but something metallic and stale. The gray light outside the cottage had been anemic, but this was a perpetual twilight, illuminated by the sickly glow of bare bulbs hanging from unseen ceilings. The ground beneath my feet was no longer earth but rough concrete, dusted with fine, insidious grit. I stopped, gasping, my chest heaving. I was no longer outside. I was inside, trapped. The walls rose around me, stained and peeling, stacked high with forgotten crates and rusting shelves. The air hung stagnant, tasting of brine and decay, not the fresh, wild tang of the coast. This was a place of forgotten things, of things left to rot. This was the commissary storage after lockdown. My mind reeled. How had I gotten here? One moment the cottage, the next this enclosed, suffocating space. A wave of nausea washed over me, blurring the edges of my vision. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to clear the static behind them. When I lowered my hands, the shelves seemed to warp, their rusted metal edges twisting into grimacing faces. Then I saw them. Not clearly, not fully formed, but as impressions, echoes in the dim light. A flicker of a pale hand reaching from behind a stack of barrels. A woman's silhouette, her hair plastered to her face, dripping water onto the concrete floor, dissolving into the gloom before I could fully focus. They were here, the others, the ones from the journal, the ones the sea had claimed. A low, mournful sound, like the distant creak of a ship's hull, vibrated through the floor. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but with my very bones. It was here. In this desolate storage, far from the light it had found me, or perhaps it had led me here. I stumbled back, my heel catching on something unseen. I fell hard against a stack of wooden crates, sending a shower of dust motes dancing in the dim light. The impact jarred my teeth. The wood felt damp, slimy beneath my fingers, despite the dry air. I scrambled away, my breath catching in my throat. No, I croaked, the word a pathetic whisper in the vast, echoing space. Get out of my head. But it was already too deep. The entity was not merely influencing my sight or sound, it was twisting the very fabric of my perception. The shelves around me seemed to shift, the walls to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The air itself began to shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt, distorting the shapes of the stacked provisions. This place, this commissary storage after lockdown, it wasn't real, not in the way I understood reality. It was a construct, a prison forged from my own unraveling mind, orchestrated by the thing that had seeped into the cottage, into the journal, into me and the sea. Even here, in this enclosed, forgotten space, I could feel its pull. It wasn't the distant roar I was accustomed to, but a deep, resonant hum, a thrumming beneath the concrete floor that echoed the rhythm of my own frantic pulse. It wasn't just calling to me anymore, it was beckoning. My determination, once a fragile shield, shattered completely. I wasn't fighting an external force anymore. I felt a morbid curiosity, a desire to sink into its depths, to become one with the victims I now saw flickering in the corners of my vision. I was no longer Diego, the reclusive artist. I was merely an extension, a vessel drawn inexorably towards the ultimate silent descent. The shimmer in the air solidified, thickening like congealed vapor, pressing in on me from every direction. My breath hitched, a ragged rasp in my throat, as the very notion of outside began to unravel. The cottage walls, once a comforting barrier against the encroaching night, now pulsed with a sickly, organic rhythm, exhaling stale air that tasted of brine and something else, something ancient and utterly putrid. It was no longer a matter of seeing things. It was a matter of being seen, of being slowly, deliberately consumed from the inside out. A profound, chilling understanding settled over me. This was not a haunting. It was a harvesting, and I was the crop. The thought, sharp and cold, cut through the haze of terror, igniting a desperate spark. I had to go, not away, not to escape, but to it. The lighthouse, its cyclopean eye and accusation on the horizon, was pulling me now with an undeniable gravitational force. It wasn't a choice, not anymore. My feet moved on their own, a phantom current guiding me out of the cottage, across the ravaged stretch of land, towards the towering structure that had stood sentinel for generations. Each step was heavy, as if I waded through unseen water, the wind a voiceless scream in my ears. The wrought iron gate, long rusted shut, yielded with a groan that echoed the one in my chest. Lighthouse door, a massive oak slab studded with barnacled iron, stood ajar, a sliver of deeper blackness beckoning. The air inside was thick with the smell of old stone, salt, and something else, a faint metallic tang like rust mixed with a distant, forgotten memory of copper. The spiral staircase, a dizzying ascent into nothingness, stretched above me, but I wasn't meant to go up. A different pull, a deeper thrum, resonated from below. The space opened into a wide, cavernous area, a labyrinth of forgotten functionality. This was the commissary storage after lockdown, a place sealed off, perhaps for decades, judging by the thick layer of dust and the skeletal remains of wooden crates. The air hung heavy here, stagnant and cloying, a mixture of mold, old provisions, and the unmistakable scent of stagnant ocean. Rusting shelves lined the walls, some still holding desiccated remnants of what might have once been rations, tins, warped beyond recognition. Sacks collapsed into fine powder. The lockdown was evident in the heavy chains that still hung from some shelves, severed or broken. And then it began. It pulsed, not with light but with sensation. I could feel its tendrils, not physical but pure intent, probing, searching, claiming. It wasn't a vision, not exactly. It was a knowing. I saw without eyes the sheer, crushing weight of the centuries it had existed, bound to this rock, to the endless churn of the sea. It was ancient, a primal hunger born of the deep, feeding on isolation, on despair, on the slow erosion of sanity. It wasn't just influencing my perceptions, it was becoming my perceptions. My own memories, my fears, my deepest traumas, they were no longer mine. They were being replayed, twisted, weaponized against me, becoming the very fabric of its terrifying manifestation. The smell of brine intensified, but now it was laced with the metallic tang of blood, the coppery scent of my own fear. The silence was broken by a soft, slithering sound, too close, too intimate. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heel catching on something unseen. I fell hard onto the concrete floor, the impact rattling my teeth. My arm shot out, blindly searching for purchase, my fingers closing around a forgotten heavy iron bar, perhaps a former pry tool left discarded years ago. A desperate, animalistic roar tore from my throat. This wasn't just a psychological assault, it was a fight for my very being. I wouldn't yield, not to this thing, whatever it was. With a primal surge of defiance, I swung the iron bar wildly into the blackness, a futile, flailing gesture against an enemy without form. The air around me rippled, as if struck by an invisible wave. It wasn't a sound heard with ears, but felt in the marrow of my bones, vibrating through every cell. It was the entity's true voice, a chorus of stolen consciousness, of shattered minds, of souls consumed. I felt myself being lifted, not physically, but spiritually drawn upwards into that terrifying cacophony. My grip on the iron bar loosened, my strength draining away as my will faltered. The commissary storage, once a place of earthly provisions, had become a tomb for the living, and I was its newest, most unwilling inhabitant. The odds were no longer against me, they had swallowed me whole. The cottage walls pulsed, a sickening, organic throb that resonated deep within my own bones. The shimmer from the air had become a suffocating, gelatinous membrane, pressing against my face, my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. The very notion of outside had indeed unraveled, replaced by a dizzying kaleidoscope of shifting light and shadow, a sensation of being pulled apart and reassembled, molecule by agonizing molecule. My teeth chattered, not from cold, but from the unbearable vibration that coursed through me, a primal fear that my very essence was being stretched thin, like taffy, until it would snap. Then, with a final, wrenching lurch, the world solidified around me. I wasn't in the cottage anymore. I was standing, or perhaps merely suspended, in a vast, echoing space. The air hung thick with the scent of brine, rust, and something else, something cloying and ancient like forgotten preserves. My eyes, still struggling to adjust, picked out the stark geometry of shelves, towering like skeletal trees, laden with crates and dust-shrouded containers. My mind reeled, grasping for purchase. How had I arrived here? The walls around me were concrete, stained with what looked like generations of damp and neglect. There were no windows, no obvious doors, only the endless, stacked inventory of a forgotten world. My breath hitched again, a ragged gasp that echoed unnervingly in the cavernous space. This wasn't a room. It was a tomb. A low hum began, not from the faulty lights, but from the very ground beneath my feet. It vibrated up through the soles of my boots, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to align with the erratic beat of my own heart. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. My skin crawled, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone in the cottage, and I certainly wasn't alone here. Not a shape, not a form, but a lack of light. A deepening of the gloom that absorbed all ambient illumination. I tried to move to back away, but my legs felt rooted to the spot, heavy as lead. My throat was dry, a desert. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and young, male and female, all speaking at once, yet forming a single, coherent message. You are here, you were called, the long wait is over. This was it then, the event. The entity, the thing that had haunted the lighthouse, that had claimed my grandmother, is finally showing itself, or at least its true nature. It was not a ghost or a demon, but something far more fundamental, an intrinsic part of this desolate stretch of coast, tethered to the beacon that pierced the perpetual gloom. Images flashed behind my eyelids. A ship, lost in a raging storm, its mast snapping like a twig, a lone figure. Silhouetted against a blinding light, staring out at an endless, churning sea. My grandmother's face etched with a profound weariness. Her eyes holding a knowledge that went beyond human comprehension. Then came the reveal. The voices, now clearer, more distinct, explained. We are the light, we are the guide. The lighthouse was not just a structure, it was a conduit, a living, breathing organ of the coast, and it demanded a soul to give it sentience, to focus its ancient, unfathomable will. My grandmother, the previous keeper, had been its vessel, her madness merely the strain of containing such an immense, ancient power, and now it was my turn. My artistic sensitivity, my reclusive nature, my very trauma, they had made me susceptible, a perfect candidate for absorption. I will become the light. I will become the keeper. The struggle, the resistance, felt pointless, utterly futile against something so vast, so ancient. I felt my individuality begin to fray at the edges, my memories dissolving into a vast ocean of collective experience. I was no longer Diego, the artist, the haunted man. I was becoming something more, something less. I was no longer in the commissary storage. I was at the very top of the lighthouse, the enormous lens gleaming before me, humming with a power that was now my power. The wind howled outside, a familiar lament. My hands, no longer my own, reached out, pressing against the cold glass of the lantern room. I saw the churning sea, the distant horizon, the faint, shimmering speck of a ship approaching. It was far off, barely discernible, but I knew it was there. I felt it. Another comes, another is drawn. Asterisk, the light pulsed strong and steady, a beacon against the encroaching night. My light, our light. The cycle continued. And somewhere, far across the waves, a new soul, perhaps seeking solitude, perhaps fleeing a past trauma, would soon feel the irresistible pull of the forgotten coast, the dilapidated cottage, and the ancient, hungry light.